We'll now have our first response from Aristotle Kallis, a professor of modern and contemporary history at the School of Humanities, Keele University in the UK. He is an expert in the study of comparative transnational generic fascism and architecture and urbanism in the interwar period, with a particular focus on Italy and Rome, but also within a comparative historical context. His most recent books include The Third Rome, The Making of the Fascist Capital, The Minimum Dwelling Revisited, Chiam's Practical Utopia, and he's currently working on 2 monographs, Fascism and Iconoclasm and Fascist Assemblages.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to also extend my thanks to the organizers. But it's a rare privilege to be involved in an event that's organized by 2 very important institutions. And you know, you mentioned that that I have worked in urbanism and architecture. Well, being in the Sapienza in this particular campus is a bit of a privilege for me, but also what a privilege to be at the American Academy. So thank you very much for the hospitality of both. I have noted the call of the organizers of this conference to not relitigate the 1963 seminar. So I will not do that, but I will play a little bit with it, just to begin. So as I was preparing for this, just writing the paper, I was trying to experiment a little bit with what is new. I mean, a lot of things are new, but then a paper like this would end up feel like a catalog of newness in that respect. So I thought, what would a paper with that title be like at the Stanford seminar in 1963? And of course, it would be either a very short paper or not a very interesting paper. What is new in fascism studies in 1963? I don't even know whether the idea of fascism studies meant anything in 1963 to begin with. So in that respect, we have a much easier role than a more difficult one, because we stand at a much bigger distance today from the 1963 seminar that the people, the participants of the seminar, stood from fascism, let alone from anything else. So there's a lot that happened and a lot of very fruitful things that happened, and being second, of course, I don't have to repeat a lot of things that my colleague has already mentioned, even if we intersect quite a lot. So in that respect, of course, a lot of things have happened in that way. But then again, the people, the participants of the 1963 seminar, Mosse, of course, the most important by virtue of the structure of the seminar, were real pioneers of the field. They were trailblazers. They were map makers. They were setting the parameters of what would become that fabled fascist or fascism studies. So we don't have that license, we don't have that opportunity, so we're kind of stuck in between these 2. I also thought of the context. The context is very different. In 1963, fascism was a still quite raw past that was felt and was still being felt at the time, but it was also at the same time a little bit more distant in comparison to what is happening right now. We live in a context where the word has come back to haunt us in ways that we hadn't probably anticipated. So in that respect, the context is very different. 2 years ago, my dear colleague Manuela Consoni had invited us in Jerusalem, and we had a similar discussion. And I was thinking how much has changed since these last 2 years. And it goes to prove. So in the best Mossian tradition of contemporary history, we're always confronted with this fascism as present past and at the same time as present future. And this is a very interesting challenge, if you like, to have in mind in that respect. In a nutshell, and you know, if you're tired already, you can switch off after this. In a nutshell, that field of fascism studies, that the 1963 seminar did so much to define and turn into a productive field, has matured substantially in the last 60-odd years. It's a field that has gone through distinct phases. When I play with this kind of generalizations of 10 words or 20 words, I think that we start with a story of essence. Then, at the same time, we get confronted with a story of origins. But we have moved on also beyond this, especially in the last 2 decades and so on and so forth. And I would just offer this as a reflection before I go through some of the milestones, if you like, and what I think very interesting changes have been. I would offer this as a point of reflection. I wonder what point such a discussion would have about fascism and what fascism is and whether it's revolutionary and whether it's palingenetic and whether it's paramilitary and whether it's all this totalitarian, I'm referring to the first stage and so on and so forth. There would have been very interesting intellectual discussions, but they are even more important and interesting because of something else that we as historians are confronted with, which is the fact that whatever that fascism was, the really interesting thing is that it gained spectacular traction in the 1920s and 30s. So we could have been here discussing the radical outliers, the footnotes of history, but we're not, because people, ordinary people, as we call them, but also political elites and people from other parts of the political spectrum, not only our outlier radical startups, but people who were part of the political mainstream and the political establishment chose to engage with that new radical reality that had for somebody who was starting in 1919 and looking at what Mussolini does in 1919, in many ways, they would have been forgiven for thinking it's got failure written all over it. And yet it didn't, and yet it became so important. So that question of traction, of appeal, you talked about circulation, I did as well in my original paper, is really, really important because it gives a different hue to our discussion about definitions, about transnational connections, about all sorts of things in that respect. And I think one of the really positive things in the last 60 years is that we have moved, the people who have become involved in the discussion of fascism, we have moved from an initial, forgive me for saying this, an initial obsession with what fascism is. We saw, which was very important in 1963, okay? So I want to be clear about this one because there was no field to navigate. But we've moved from this kind of era of what fascism is, and then this not so nice era, in my opinion, of fascism versus fascism, what fascism is not, to an era of what I think has been happening of fascism and fascism as part of this kind of opening up of the vistas, which to me is probably the most positive and welcome change. Now, in 2004, 20 and a bit years back, it's funny, writing about these things brings back all these memories. There was a debate, and I think some of us who are here were invited to this debate. It was organized by a German journal, Erwägen, Wissen, Ethik, and it was about, in some respects, a version of what's new in fascism studies. The new in fascism studies, and I will not get into a lot of details into this one, of course, was Roger Griffin's decade-long, by that time, definition of fascism. You saw it earlier on in the presentation, but also his claim, rather provocative claim, that there is now a new consensus. Okay, now I'm not going to get into this discussion, but it was interesting as a participant as well to look back at this debate, because the format was quite different to what we're doing today. So it was all conducted virtually through the pages of the journal. There was a main article, there were responses, and then there was a main article from Roger Griffin, responses, and then a response from Roger Griffin, and a final round of comments. So not different, but not similar either. Not too different, but not similar either. And looking back at this, I was struck at how interesting intellectually, but actually non-productive that exercise was. And in my opinion, that was a milestone. It was, I'm taking some liberties here with the chronology, but it was what I consider to be the end of the definitional cycle. A cycle that had started with the pioneering work of Mosse. I mean, there is the word definition coming up in the Stanford papers a lot. Of course, we go into the 80s and 90s where the definitional debate peaks. And it becomes involved in this discussion of what I said, what fascism is not. And that was the peak, because in many ways, and I think many of us, and I'll speak mostly for myself, but also for some colleagues that I have an opportunity to talk about afterwards, it was a realization that the battle lines are drawn, people will not move on the definitional front. What's the point in having this discussion and banging against the wall? But before we go to that point, I want to mention two names, and they stand on either side of this 2004, if you like, terminus. Those of us who have been working in fascism studies will probably have at some point read and definitely mentioned many, many times, 1979 article by Gilbert Allardyce, What Fascism is Not. And it was a moment where Allardyce reacted to the opening of the field of fascism studies that Mosse and other people at Stanford were trying to achieve. So it was the backlash. It was like, you've gone too far, okay? That article is referenced too many times, in my opinion, guilty as charged. It's a very interesting discussion, but it is one of the articles that is known most for its notoriety than for other things. Fast forward a few things. In 2012, I was invited, technically I co-organized, but I was invited by my colleague Antonio Costapinto, who is here in an event in Lisbon. And there I encountered a scholar of sociology who was involved in fascism studies, but was not a fascism scholar, if you like, who did something similar to what Gilbert Allardyce did, but from a very different point of view and with a very different intent. I was very lucky to have met Michel Daubry, and as part of that meeting, Michel Daubry wrote a paper, and I had the opportunity to reread this chapter while preparing this. And it's a very interesting paper. He starts from the point of what became quite standard criticism of these definitional approaches to fascism and this tendency to try and categorize and create criteria and taxonomies and try and say, oh, this doesn't fit, therefore it's not fascism, and so on and so forth. And Daubry reacted to this, but unlike Allardyce, who was trying to say, do not do this, do not do that, do not conflate these two, he went exactly the opposite way. He said, compare the incomparable, open up, embrace the difference in comparison rather than the expected similarity. And something else, he said, as a kind of exhortation to fascism studies, to which he was referring when he wrote this. Change the enigma, by which he meant ask new questions and expect that these questions will not deliver similarities, but they will open up the vistas that will make us even realize the fact that this little fascism, into inverted commas, as a cognitive field that we're talking about, has so many impacts and sometimes collateral effects in the other areas. I've turned back to this chapter many, many times, because I think this is what is happening anyway in the field of fascism studies ever since. Embracing the gray zones, which incidentally is in the best Mossian traditions as well. Extending, expanding, not shying away from leaving the comfort zone of a specific, well-defined area. Mosse was one of the first people who acknowledged that fascism, even in his effort to try and give it intellectual substance, he acknowledged the fact that if you look individually at what fascism was doing, what it was espousing, there's not much originality there in individual aspects. We talked about nationalism, we talked about the state, we talked about totalitarianism, we're going to talk about all the other things. The alignment, the synthesis, the narratives constructed, and of course then the radicalization makes a lot of sense. Mosse was talking about fascism being a scavenger, which I think is a wonderful metaphor, and in so many ways. So I see this kind of the end of the definitional and the fascism is not sort of discussions, opened up this language, but also shared field to begin to ask these broader questions. Where does this take us, one way or another? You talked about transnational, so I will not talk about this in any detail, but what did the transnational approach offer us? It offers us an understanding of the fact that not only is fascism unintelligible, confined into artificial national containers, obviously, but it also made us realize something else, that the history of fascism cannot be told through the lens of it being something fixed. Fixed intellectually, fixed politically, fixed culturally. So we have to trace the connections. We have to trace fascism's ability, knack for appealing, for crossing borders, the protean nature of it as it was crossing borders, and to stop thinking of all the we talked in the morning about the primary role of the Italian and the German model, of which Paxton is one of the main reinforcers with his 5 stages, much that I have a huge respect for this work. This idea of the peripheries of fascism as people who are largely or mostly or to some extent imitate something, that fascism sort of crosses borders as something fixed, and that the people who receive it are just waiting there for it to be enlightened by it and to copy it. That all these ideas have come under a lot of pressure. We have people, a lot of people, we meet every year or so, some of us, and we discuss new research in the so-called peripheries of fascism, in places like Central and Eastern Europe. I was born and raised in one of them. If you want to test the limits of what fascism is not, dip your toes into Greek fascism, and so on and so forth. And yet all these questions are really interesting and enlightening about this story of circulation, not even diffusion. I want to mention one more name and then I will conclude. Again, from somebody who is not a standard fascism scholar. Kurt Wayland, political scientist. I hope he will be okay with me calling him that. Published a book. He epitomizes, in my opinion, what I would call the diffusionist approach to fascism. Now, diffusion is a funny word because it may still imply that there is something sitting on a shelf, see Italian fascism, National Socialism, and so on, that then gets diffused and others pick up and say, oh yes, okay, this is what it is. It doesn't mean that. But he makes a very interesting point. He says that we have to accept the fact that what really diffused and the real success of what we call fascism in the 1920s and 30s was not the radical outliers, but the fact that fascism became a catalyst for a wider authoritarian, anti-democratic, and so on wave. This is what I meant by the kind of research on the collateral consequences of fascism. That even when we say that, and I use the example of Greece in my case, I mentioned a couple of scholars who work on Greek fascism on my paper, even when we talk about country X as a case of a failure of fascism, what we also have to confront is the fact that in many cases there was a shift to authoritarian solutions. Dictatorships, the history of dictatorships is much bigger than the history of fascism, and yet it's so interwar dictatorships, and yet it's so intimately linked in some respects as a collateral effect. And what Wayland offered to this discussion was that he said that the story of fascist diffusion is not just of people enthusiastically embracing fascism, it's also a story of people who reacted to it, in many cases by accepting some parts of it and then using them to turn against the real fascists, into inverted commas, which to me is a very interesting way of thinking about some recent analysis of this circulatory idea of fascism. So, from the story of essence, from the story of definition, from the story of what fascism is not, for the story of origins, constructing these genealogies of fascism, reverse engineering fascism intellectually, very dubious intellectual exercise, very interesting but very dubious. We're moving towards a story of expanded vistas and above all, a story of connections, of movement, of dynamic, of process, of contingency, of unpredictability of that thing that we call fascism. I will finish with, again, a very, very short reflection. As part of me researching this paper, thinking of what I write of this paper, I had the opportunity to read George Mosse's memoirs. And it's one of those quotes that I think I have seen somewhere else, but about his intellectual restlessness. That he was a traveler, somebody who was always moving, who didn't like stasis, and so on and so forth. And I think one of the ways in which the study of fascism has benefited immensely in the last, not 60 necessarily, but definitely 20 or 30 years, is that we have adopted different, to use a very contemporary digital analogy, different levels of resolution. Some of us are zooming out, going for the bigger pictures and the connections of the broader picture. Some of us are zooming in. And as you zoom out and as you zoom in, there are interesting patterns that come and go. Somebody who's zooming out is able to see more generic patterns. Somebody who's zooming in is kind of sometimes consumed by difference. But this is the important part of it. So this is something that has become a trademark of what we can call fascism studies in that respect, to continue to adopt these different perspectives, but also a shift towards the opening up of the vistas. And as a final point, I was thinking, I am here doing this reflection on what's new in fascism studies since then. And I think that the participants of the 1963 seminars would have been quite happy with the discussions we're having right now, even if they don't agree with everything. And I hope that a similar paper 60 years from now will be able to chronicle the expansion, the continuing expansion of the field of fascism in that respect. Thank you very much.